Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
We were launching at the Kennedy Space Center, and our target was to have the thing land in a lagoon. Well, there was a French gentleman that was out there doing some work on the pad, and he accidentally ignited the rocket. Unfortunately, because it wasn't supposed to go, they hadn't cleared the lagoon. There's a guy there fishing, and he got pretty close. And he was really mad.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. Born into an Air Force family, Keith grew up on bases across the world, from Scotland to Italy to Texas, where he describes a poignant last farewell to President Kennedy before his assassination. His career in the US Air Force placed him behind the scenes of America's most critical aircraft, including time at RAF Upper Heyford during the tense early 1980s. There he lived through chemical attack drills, nuclear strike simulations, and the ever-present pressure of NATO-Soviet confrontation. Rising to become an astronautical engineer, Keith later worked on GPS satellites and experiments flown on the Space Shuttle. I'm delighted to welcome Keith Longstreth to our Cold War conversation.
My father was in the Air Force. He was a weather forecaster. My mother was a weather observer for a little while. And when she was going to school to become a weather observer, that's where she met my dad, who was an instructor. She happened to fail the course that he was taking. She said it was because she couldn't keep her mind on what he was teaching, and she was kind of starstruck by him. I don't know, it makes a good story, but they did get married, and my mom had to get out of the Air Force. Beautiful wedding photos, my dad in his dress blue uniform, and typical for 1952 when they got married.
So in the 1950s, if your wife was already in the Air Force, they would have to leave. So the woman would have to leave the Air Force if they got married to somebody. Is that correct?
Yes, that's my understanding. And that's why she left. But she was in during the Korean War era. So she was technically a Korean War era vet, which helped her out much later in life. The VA came in with a lot of money to support her in a assisted living facility toward the end of her life. So that was great. Unexpected. But
that is good. So with your dad's role as a weather forecaster, was he posted around all over the place and you had to trail around with him?
Sometimes he went by himself. Like he went to Korea for a year, almost a year, and then we couldn't go then. There was independents were not allowed in Korea at that time. And then there was a little something going on in Turkey and Lebanon, and he went there for about 9 months, and of course we weren't allowed there either. But he was still doing the same thing, weather forecasting. In fact, he had given a weather forecast for a plane that got shot down over Russia. So he had to go into the Pentagon when they did the investigation on that.
Was he quite a senior rank?
No, not really. I mean, at that time, he was a technical sergeant with 5 stripes. And it wasn't until we lived in Italy that he made his 6th stripe. He became a master sergeant. And he retired as the Air Force with 7 stripes, a senior master sergeant.
November 22nd, 1963 is quite an important date in US history. And you had quite a unique experience on that day.
I did. That was the day that President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. And we were on a base, and Well, at the same base we were at during the Cuban Missile Crisis was Carswell Air Force Base, which doesn't exist anymore. And it was in Fort Worth, which is maybe 60 miles from Dallas. So he spent the night in Fort Worth, and his plane was parked on the ramp a long ways from anything else, I guess for security purposes and what have you. But on the fence that went around the ramp, just on the other side of the fence, was the elementary school that all the kids that lived on base went to. And the fourth graders and above were allowed to go out, leave the classroom, go down to the fence, and see him board the airplane. And my older sister and I, we both had this memory of watching him walk up the steps. He got to the top of the steps, and before entering the plane, he turned and he waved to us. And then just a couple hours later, our teachers told us that he had been killed. It was quite a shocking experience.
That's incredible. One of the last people to see him alive. Now, with your dad's role as a weather forecaster, he gets posted to a very exotic location in Scotland, and I say that sort of tongue in cheek, I guess.
Yeah. After he got back from Hawaii, he actually went down to a classified school outside of San Antonio to learn, I guess, a different aspect of weather forecasting. And then they shipped us to Kirknewton, RAF Kirknewton in Scotland. During that time, I mean, it's a very small base. I still remember it well. I particularly like it that in the British money, the sixpence piece was the same size as the American penny. So American pennies were not allowed in Britain, which meant that things that we would buy, like comic books, which were 12 cents, we only had to pay 10 cents for. Well, for, a fourth grader, that was important. It was saving money on comic books, all because a penny was the same size as a sixpence.
It must have been quite a culture shock to go from Texas to Scotland, particularly weather-wise.
Oh, yes, it was. And on top of that, I had to go to Scottish schools, which meant I had to wear a school uniform. Gray wool knee socks, gray wool shorts, a gray long sleeve shirt with a gray sleeveless vest over top that, a black and turquoise tie, a blazer, and the goofiest little hat you could ever think of. Yeah, that's what I had to wear to school. So the school in Scotland, the kids, I had no problem with them at all. It was a little bit weird eating in the cafeteria because you had to eat. Anyway, you were assigned to a house and you ate with the house. Everything was served family style. The older kids would go and get the food, bring it to you, serve it up. And then when we were all done, the younger kids had to take all the dishes back to the kitchen to get washed up. That was the first place I had ever had steak and kidney pie. It could have been worse, so I guess they could have fed us haggis. But overall, it was a good experience. I was finishing fourth grade and I was learning how to do long division with money. Now, the fact that the British money was not using the decimal system yet, it made it very difficult for a little 9-year-old American boy to understand the difference between a pound, a shilling, a crown, a half crown, a sixpence, a threepence. a penny, a halfpenny, and a farthing, and then a guinea on top of that, which is 1 pound and 1 shilling. It made it difficult to learn long division with that. But I got through it. That was not a problem. My teacher thought I did have a problem with handwriting. And the Scots practiced corporal punishment. And in this case, as in all cases for my grade, the corporal punishment was stand in front of the class, hold your hand out, and she would hit it with the belt. Actually, both hands with the belt. And in my case, it was because my handwriting was bad. And that's when I learned that the American cursive script was not exactly the same as the Scottish cursive script. Some of the letters were not formed the same way. Yeah, that was a learning lesson.
It must be really difficult doing a move like that. I mean, I'm intrigued. What did you make of steak and kidney pudding? Did you think it was okay?
I did. And honestly, since that time, I did have the opportunity to have some, as an adult, to have some haggis. And I can say it was okay as long as you had some Glenfiddich to wash it down with.
Definitely. I mean, long division mystified me even with decimal currency. So I can't even imagine trying to do it with pounds, shillings and pence. But anyway, so while you're in Scotland, Sir Winston Churchill passes away, which is a real major event in the UK. Did you watch that on TV, or how did you get to hear about it?
I did watch it on TV. In fact, I found a large similarity between his lying in state and Parliament and then travel up the Thames to his ancestral home to be very similar to what J.F. Kennedy did when he traveled from the Capitol building on a wagon-pulled caisson across the White House and across the Potomac River to the Arlington Cemetery. Both of those kind of did something in me, made me make a connection between the two gentlemen. And little did I know that at that time that when Churchill died, that 2 years later, less than 2 years later, I would be living or going to high school in that very area and visiting Blenheim Palace and seeing where he was laid to rest.
We will come on to that in a moment, because before you moved somewhere else in the UK, you actually moved to much warmer climes in terms of Brindisi in Italy.
Yes, and in fact, we drove down the Brindisi, and we had a big American station wagon. And it was bad enough driving on the little single track roads in England and Scotland, but once we got into Italy, it became, well, downright frightening sometimes. Traveling these roads along the coast that was just steep drop off all the way down to the water. We did have a 1 week delay on the way down in Germany from my dad to get some training on what he was going to be doing in Brindisi. Yeah, but it was a great trip. I can remember we spent Easter Sunday. We were in Lucerne, Switzerland, and somehow my parents had smuggled chocolate Easter bunnies in the car that we didn't know about, and they gave them to us that morning while we were going through the St. Gothard train tunnel. And what a difference, you got all the snow on one side and you come out on the Italian side and it's all melted and hot, and it was like night and day.
It must be incredible experiences at that age. I mean, how old were you then? You must have been about 10 or 11.
I was. I was 10 going on 11.
Wow. And what was the education like in Italy? Did you have to be in an Italian school for that one?
No, that would have asked too much. I think that they did have a school on the base. San Vito de' Normandy was the name of the base. And it was a tiny base, but they did have a school that had started off as a 4-room school with 2 grades in each room. And because I had gone to Scottish schools and they considered Scottish schools far superior to the American schools, and I did sufficiently well that instead of finishing 5th grade, when I got to Italy, they just moved me in the 6th grade, and I did the last half of 6th grade along with the first half of 5th grade. I got to that brand new classroom, and my teacher, Mr. Kinney, he said, "Come write your name on the board." And I printed it, and he said, "Don't you know how to write? And I said, "Yes, I do," but it was my teacher in Scotland that made me not want to write in cursive, but just print. Yeah. And then we did all of 7th grade. Well, my older sister, we were in the same class after that point. So, and we did all 7th grade together. And then after that, we went back to the States. But when I was in Italy, I did join the Boy Scouts, and often we camped out with the Italian Scouts on a beautiful little treed area on the beach down south of Brindisi in Lecce. And it was great. We would feed them sea rations most of the time, just canned meals, and heat them up. But always on Sunday when we would this game of battle to take the other people's flag. And when we were playing this, the Italian scout leaders were cooking tomato sauce and noodles, and we knew that when we were done with capture the flag, that's it, that we would get spaghetti, and it was always so good. I could still taste the, cooked over an open fire. The sauce was just amazing.
That sounds really evocative, what you've just described there. So your dad is then back in the States for, I think, a year. And then he's posted back to the UK, and he's posted to Cheltenham.
Yes.
I can't imagine why he's posted there.
Well, the 1 year that he was back in the States, he was on an army post, Fort Meade, and that is the home of a 3-letter organization that begins with an N. And yeah, with NSA. And he got transferred to the British equivalent of that.
So GCHQ in Cheltenham. And I believe there was only 7 US Air Force.
There was about 100 total Americans here, but they really kept the number of military down, and they tried to not let anybody know there were military there. There were no like Air Force staff cars or anything that were ever in the area, but there were 7 at that time anyway. Air Force people there.
Did your dad ever talk about what he did during the Cold War to you? Did he ever? No.
No, not a chance. And I still have questions. What I think was that weather satellites do more than take pictures of the weather. And also, if you're listening to radio signals and things like that, the weather could have impact on your ability to get a good signal.
I guess weather forecast, it just sounds like such an innocuous name. And I don't know, in my deviousness, I imagine it being a cover for something a little bit more intriguing, but we'll never know, Keith.
No. Although from my experience as a engineer working on GPS satellites, I do know that the GPS satellites have another payload that has nothing to do with navigation. And as the engineer, we were under instructions that under no circumstances were we ever to turn that other payload off without the customer's okay. Even if it meant losing control of the satellite completely, we could not turn that other payload off without the customer's permission. And I don't know who the customer was. There were just somebody that was on the other end of an encrypted phone line. But I know what the payload did. It detected nuclear detonations. It was funny. It was kind of cool. They would have us calibrate the sensors every now and then, and they were based in some town in Florida. So in the summertime, when there's a lot of lightning storms and the satellite was passing over, they would have us put it in the calibration mode, and then they would record the number of lightning bolts from the ground and see how that matched what was picked up by the satellite. And then they would send us a value to input into the satellite to adjust the sensitivity of the sensor.
So back to Cheltenham in the late 1960s. Are you in an English school for that, or has your experience of British schools scarred you for life?
Well, no and no. It was mainly a case of my older sister and I. We knew that we would be in Cheltenham for 3 years, and we would be coming back to the States, and we would graduate from a high school in the States. So we felt, after what happened in the Scotland schools and then wanting to move up and everything, and we thought it would be easier if we went to an American school. There were 3 American high schools in the UK at that time. There was one at Lakenheath, which had 7-day boarding facilities. There was one in London at Bushy Park that had a 5-day boarding facility, so everybody had to go home on the weekend. And then there was Upper Heyford, which was a daily commute. But what we got was great. I mean, it was a great school. At the Upper Heyford, the facilities were not necessarily the best. They were old, but the instructors were incredible. Every year we got to go to Blenheim Palace and go see a play at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon. And one year, in my chemistry class, we went down south of Oxford to Abington, and we got to see a experimental nuclear reactor, and that was cool.
Wow,
that was cool. We got to stand above it and looked at the rods that they were using to control the reaction. It was, well, it's since been taken down. So
that sounds incredible. I mean, that must have been quite a journey each day to get to Upper Heyford from Cheltenham.
It was 47 miles one way. And so I took the bus, old motor coach, 2 hours. And for the first hour, it was just the 6 of us kids from Cheltenham. And then once we got to Occasionally burnt on the water. There was somebody that was assigned the RAF Little Rissington that they lived in Burton on the water, and so every now and then we would pick up a kid and Burton in the water. But mainly it was from Chipping Norton on. We were picking up kids who were assigned. The parents were assigned the Upper Heyford, so we had a full bus by the time we got to school. The school days were 6 hours long, 9 to 3, and then we spent 4 hours a day on the bus.
Wow. Wow. Mind you, the Cotswolds is a very pretty part of the UK to be looking out of the window of a bus for, but I guess the novelty wears off pretty quickly.
We had the same bus driver all the time. The other people there working at the company, Harry's Coaches is what it was. His nickname was Judy because his last name was Garland. He was born in 1901, and he had all these sayings that he would tell us as, particularly when we would go over Stolen the Wold, he would say, "Wind on the hill, water in the mill," or "Fog in the valley, good day the follow."
Wow. 1901.
Yeah.
Lost languages, lost sayings by the sound of it. So when you got back to the US, had you sort of picked up an English accent or not?
I think so. I mean, that one year I was in Maryland when I finished my high school, and there were people that, well, they thought I wasn't American anyway. And every now and then, a Scottish phrase like "I dinna ken" would slip out of my mouth, and then that would really throw them.
Brilliant. So you're back in the US. You're just finishing high school, were you then?
And yes, in 1971.
Okay, and so what are you looking to do for employment? Is there an obvious path for you?
Well, I had been working first as a paper boy, and then I worked as a dishwasher, and then a short order cook. And I was doing that while I was going to the local community college for a year. Remember, I was graduated high school a year earlier than most people. So technically, when I started the community college, for one day, I was still 16 when I started college, and then turned 17. But the college, it just felt like another year of high school, except that it was my money that was paying for it. Fortunately, it wasn't that expensive, and I was making enough. But my biggest fear was getting drafted into the Army, and I didn't want that. I talked to my dad about it, and he couldn't assure me that the war would be over by the time I hit the 18-year point.
The war that Keith is talking about here is the Vietnam War.
So I went down to the Air Force recruiter, and I took an aptitude test to see what skills I was good at. And the only thing I scored high in was electronics. I'd never had any electronics, but I knew that what I was good at is working in a laboratory setting. So I wanted to work in an electronics lab. So the recruiter gave me a list of different jobs that would fit that kind of general category. And my dad, rather than rely on the recruiter, my dad pulled copies of the actual job descriptions out of the regulations for me. And that's when I chose the precision measurement equipment specialty. and working in a precision measurement equipment laboratory, which covered all kinds of instruments. Anything that measured anything eventually found its way back to the base. PMEL, it was called, the Precision Measurement Equipment Lab.
What is the importance of this within the US Air Force? Can you just give me some examples on how important that role is and what potentially could go wrong if that job isn't done properly?
Okay, well, the equipment that I worked on, that I specialized in, after I had a little try at everything, there were tactical navigation systems, which obviously are important that they work right so that planes can find their target. The identification friend of foe system, but also little things too. Something as simple as a strut gauge. You know, the airplanes on the front wheel, they have a hydraulic strut that keeps the gear and the wheel on the ground, but you have to maintain a certain amount of pressure in there. And there was a case at my first base in upstate New York. My roommate had calibrated one of these strut gauges, and they're simple little gauges, just a little boron tube that when pressure is applied in it, this tube tries to uncurl, and when it uncurls, it makes a needle move. And they go up to 3,000 pounds per square inch. Anyway, this guy had picked this gauge up and had dropped it on the floor, and then he just put it back on the shelf for somebody else to use. This is somebody that actually works on the aircraft, did that. And it turned out that this particular aircraft that somebody used that instrument to check was a plane that was on Victor Alert. It was loaded with nukes, ready for takeoff within 15 minutes of notification. And the nose gear collapsed because somebody let out too much pressure because that gauge was faulty. We never worked on anything that was actually part of the plane. We were once removed. We worked on the equipment that the people use to check out the parts of the plane.
I understand you met your first wife in Plattsburgh. How did that come about?
My roommate, the one that had calibrated that gauge, in fact, he was from Burlington, Vermont. He didn't have a car. I did. As the story goes, he got me introduced me to a girl that I really kind of fell hell over heels with. And it gave me a reason to go to Burlington every weekend.
And this place you were in Plattsburgh. So this was your first posting. What was it like, coming in as the new guy? What how was the place? Was the place effectively managed?
No, it wasn't. It if it had been the only female I was ever assigned to, I would have never stayed in the Air Force. Yeah. It was one of these places where if you didn't go out bowling and drinking with the boss, then you just got treated like you were a third-class citizen. And actually, he treated everybody that was single and living in the barracks that same way, regardless of whether or not they went out with them. So, but apparently, I guess if you're married and you're a kind of mid-range non-commissioned officer, like a staff sergeant or a tech sergeant, then you would need his endorsement to get promoted.
But your next posting is more professional, let's say, I think.
It certainly was. and a lot different from New York. It was in the Philippines, Clark Air Base, which sadly got wiped out by Mount Pinatubo when it erupted years after I was there. But the laboratory there was actually not just a laboratory for Clark, but it was a depot level laboratory for the entire Pacific area. And we also went out on site to do some calibrations. In fact, one of those places I went to calibrate equipment was Hong Kong. And it was kind of weird because the equipment sat on a mountaintop. It was American-owned equipment that we took care of, but the place was ran by the Royal Air Force because nobody wanted the Chinese to know that it was American equipment. On the other hand, they kind of had to know that because it provided radar for the old Hong Kong airport, which was right downtown in the middle of all sorts of stuff. But still, it was a great temporary duty. 10 days in Hong Kong, which I spent about 2.5 days actually working. And the rest of the time, we went sightseeing and shopping.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Yeah, I've heard landing at that airport was quite challenging because you're flying in between like tower blocks and things like that.
The old Kai Tak airport.
And in the Philippines, you were working on F-111s or the FB-111 at Plattsburgh. What about at Clark?
At Clark, it was F-4s and C-130s. C-130 is the propeller turboprop cargo plane. They did have C-141s, which was a jet cargo plane. But Clark was also where they brought all the POWs and all the refugees when they were leaving Vietnam. They brought them all to Clark first. Clark had a major hospital for the region. They set up tent cities for all the refugees. I didn't see that, but the tents were still up when I got to Clark.
Wow. So your next posting is to Griffiths in the US.
Yes.
And you're working on the venerable B-52.
Well, Griffiths was a strategic air command base. Again, they flew B-52s and KC-135 tankers. The B-52, I can't believe it. It's still flying, and they're looking at keeping it flying past its 100-year mark.
It's unbelievable. It is literally unbelievable.
But yeah, Griffiths also had some fighters that were part of the NORAD. They acted as interceptors for airplanes that may happen to stroll across the North American air defense line by accident, or not by accident. But mainly it was the SAC base. And, I grew up on SAC base, and I always believed that this SAC had, or they said anyway, I believed that too until I got to Upper Heyford.
Which we will come to in a moment. Now, Griffiths, you when we had the call beforehand, you were telling me about the calibration of the tail gun of the B-52.
Oh yeah. There's a instrument that one of the other maintenance squads used to calibrate and check the accuracy of the radar that guides the tail gun. And that's done with a piece of equipment that sends a signal to the radar that makes it think that there's a plane following it. And as this piece of equipment rotates, then the gun will rotate with it, and it's kind of unnerving when you're standing next to it and your equipment rotates and you see this 4-barrel big gun, tail gun, following you as your equipment moves from one side to the other side.
Yeah, I guess you're always very trusting that they've disarmed it properly before you're doing that sort of test.
Absolutely.
Wow. Wow.
And Griffiths gets a lot of snow. First, going from the Philippines to Griffiths. The first year I was at Griffiths, we got 150 inches of snow. And the second year, we routinely had temperatures of below minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So anyway, really, really cold.
So it must have made Scotland appear almost tropical then.
Yeah, it did. But they dressed us well, warm. We had full Arctic gear. Yeah, and it was a very big laboratory. It was bigger than the one in terms of people. It was bigger than the one at Clark. The Griffiths one had 75 people, technicians, because there was a large research and development center there too, and that was mainly why they had so many more people. When I was at Clark, my supervisor and trainer, we became good friends, and he had been at Upper Heyford before. So from Clark, he went to New Mexico for a year, and I for 2 years, and I went to Griffiths in Rome, New York, for 2 years, and we both decided we wanted to go back to England. And we both applied and to make sure that we got accepted, we volunteered for a long tour, which normally a tour with families 3 years, and we volunteered for a 4-year tour. And we both got assigned to RAF Feltwell, which is where the laboratory is for Lakenheath and Mildenhall, and we both asked to be changed from Feltwell to Upper Heyford, and they changed us. And he got there about a month before I did, but yeah, he was the first person I saw when I got to Heyford.
Brilliant. That must have been very welcoming to see a familiar face who you'd worked with before and you were friends with.
Yeah, it was, but that should not have been the first person to greet me. I mean, we have a sponsor system, and the lab at Upper Heyford was so backlogged that we were working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week just to try and get caught up. And it shouldn't have been that way. It was due to the manager of the laboratory. He would never tell us until Friday if we had to come to work on Saturday. When he left, things changed. We were running at one point almost a 60-day backlog. So people were bringing equipment in, and it would be like 60 days before we could get it calibrated and back to them. And a lot of shops couldn't wait that long, so they would send a priority letter, which meant we had to stop what we were doing to do this piece of equipment on a priority. And eventually everything became a priority. Well, he left. New management came in, and the first thing he said was, "We will know on Monday morning whether or not you will need to go work on the following Saturday." And he would say, and it's based like this: if the backlog is down to a certain point, you won't have to work at all on Saturday. and if it gets even lower, then we'll give you a half a day off during the week. It got to the point where we were working only 3.5 days a week because we were just staying on top of the work. And not only were we staying on top of the work, but the quality of the work had improved too. The customers were happy. The inspectors were happy.
Yeah, and you were only working half a week. Brilliant. Everybody wins. Everybody wins. It must have been really weird being back at Upper Heyford sort of 10, 11 years after you'd been to school there.
It was very different looking. And in fact, I was talking to a fellow Heyford guy last night and explaining to him the difference, how it looked. When I was in high school and we would come across from the west, Heyford sat overlooking the Charwell River Valley. Lower Heyford was in the middle, in the bottom of the valley, and Upper Heyford was on top. And when we would come over the edge and going down into the Charwell River Valley, on a sunny day, all you could see was the buildings of the school, and they were all white. I mean, they stood out like glistening, white, sparkling buildings. When I went back, everything was painted olive drab. What couldn't be painted had camouflage netting on it. They were building bomb-proof shelters for each and every aircraft. And the shelters were coated with paint that induced the growth of moss, so that it would reduce the heat signature if you were looking at the shelter from above, so you couldn't tell if there was a plane in it or not. Yeah, everything had changed. Something had drastically changed, and it was the tension between the Soviet Union and NATO.
Because you're there in the early 80s when particularly the Soviets were getting very paranoid about the possibility of the US or NATO carrying out a first strike, so attacking the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons first. So I guess you were involved in a number of TACIVALs there. A TACIVAL is a tactical evaluation exercise. So these were exercises to test the defences of the airfield on both the ground and in the air.
Well, TACIVALs, and they had usually one a month, and they lasted a week. Sometimes we knew they were coming. Sometimes we didn't know. One time there was a NATO TACIVAL, and we didn't know it until a German F-4 made a imitation strafing run of the runway, and then the TACIVAL said, "You're on," and so they would stress everything. They would simulate launching the planes that are on Victor alert immediately, and then they would simulate drops of like mustard gas or nerve gas. And on one day, usually the Thursday or the Friday of the TACIVAL, it would always run through the scenario where a nuclear weapon got dropped on London and the fallout was drifting toward Heyford. And we had to generate, meaning launch every single plane we had. And I believe at that time we had around 40 planes. And to keep it more realistic, each and every plane taxied down the runway to the ammo area. A real nuke got loaded on the plane. And then they taxied all the way down the runway again and then back, and the nuke got offloaded. A training bomb got put on, and then the planes took off. And I've been told by pilots that were at Upper Heyford at the time that the normal range they went to is they would go east out over the North Sea, hang a left, and go north as far as Loch Ness. They turn over Loch Ness, and this is all at like 50 feet off the ground, and fly the length of Loch Ness, do an inverted rise and back down, electronically drop the weapons, and then fly back to Upper Heyford.
Wow. Well, yeah, I've got an interview with an F-111 pilot. I have to send you the link for that because he tells an entertaining story there about flying over the locks with a trainee. Now, what was your role during a tachyval? What were you tasked with doing? I'm presuming you're carrying a weapon during that, yeah?
Well, no, although I had to be ready to. In fact, before I even was accepted to go to Upper Heyford, I had to requalify on the M16. And I had to sign NATO required that I sign a statement saying that I would not draw or put my weapon into working position unless I was going to shoot to kill. So no warning shots. If it was serious enough to do a warning shot, then you just didn't do it. It was like all or nothing. We weren't playing games. That was kind of unnerving to me because it had been years since I didn't grow up with guns, and it had been years since I had shot a M16. But fortunately, I didn't get to do that. There were some people in PML that was their job. There were security police augmentees, they were called, and they were usually the really young troops, the 1 and 2 stripers that got stuck doing that. Some of the PML people were on the runway repair team, so that if a bomb got dropped on the runway, making it unusable, then the rapid runway repair team would fill it in and put steel over top the hole to make it useful again. But my main role was the radiation detection equipment and making sure that it was all calibrated and working during a alarm black situation, which says that there's a gas present, either a nerve agent or mustard gas or something like that. But there was always the presumption that the returning plane would have gone through, if they had dropped a nuclear bomb, he would be covered with radioactive material. So there was an instrument called a PAC-1S that I calibrated everyone on the base, and the technicians would run it over the aircraft, particularly around the doors and stuff, to make sure that the aircraft was clean of radiation. And if it wasn't, then they had to go through a cleaning procedure before the aircrew was even allowed to get out of the plane. So that was, I guess, my contribution to the tachyvals was taking care of the radiation detection equipment.
I presume you were spending quite long periods of time in your chemical suit with your helmet and gas mask as well.
Yes. I was there for 3 years and 3 months. So that's like 39 months. So that's 39 months times 5 days. That's over 180 days. I wore that chemical suit. with my gas mask and the helmet at my side. And the chemical suits, they were really hot. And, I worked inside most of the time. And I can say, I know this is funny, I can say thank you very much that most British restrooms, the dividers go all the way to the floor and the doors go all the way to the floor so that somebody could take their mask off when they're sitting in the loo and catch some fresh air and nobody would be able to know it. And that's what we had to do. After wearing the gas mask for 12 hours, you have a headache that you just cannot believe. We were fortunate in that the calibration lab was on the other side of the runway from most of the base. So we had permission to drive our private vehicles directly to the lab. And if you were driving a military vehicle, you had to wear your gas mask. But if you were driving your private vehicle, the driver could take the gas mask off. But not in the military vehicle. A guy I worked with, he had this recurring dream or nightmare of sitting and holding his son while he was wearing his gas mask during a gas attack, knowing that there was nothing he could do to save his son because his mask would not fit his son. And if he tried to make it fit, they would both just end. They would both just die. They always told us that there would be time to get the families out and back to the States, out of our harm's way and back to the States. That's what they told us. And we said, yeah, we believe you. But honestly, if that was the case, why would they need airplanes on ready alert? it, it, it really begs that question. If you can have time to get the dependents back, then you don't need planes ready to go, loaded with nukes, ready to take off in 15 minutes. There was something else that just popped in my head. I mean, not only was the issue with the Russians, but at the same time that was going on, for our concern, when we did a lot of off-site calibrations, and we had two trucks that we used. One was an Air Force blue truck that said United States Air Force on it. The other one wasn't. The other one was just an olive drab truck. And we would never take that truck if we didn't have to, because we were so afraid that we would be mistaken for a British Army truck and the IRA would hit us. So we always tried to make it obvious that we were American and not British Army.
Wow. That's interesting, because this was at the height of the IRA attacks on the British forces in Germany, particularly.
Yeah, and it was all happening at the same time. So the rule at Heyford was the Queen's Highway went right through the middle of the base. If you were on the south side of the highway, which is where all the housing and everything was, you were exempt from the exercise. Once you cross the highway, you were not part of the exercise anymore. But there were some things that normal people had to get to, like the Postal Service Center, which had all the mailboxes that people had, and they would go and check their mail every day. That was on the north side. That was in the part of the base that was affected by the exercise. So I was out with the friend. The alarm went off. Exercise, exercise, exercise. Alarm black, alarm black, alarm black. which meant this is a gas attack. Take immediate cover. The closest cover we had, well, first was put your mask on, and then we took cover inside the Postal Service Center, which just had long hallways just full of mailboxes. And they would turn all the lights off, and we were all sitting in there. Sometimes these alarm blacks last hours, and there was dozens of people sitting in there with gas masks and helmets and chemical suits on. And there was a woman came in with a little boy, and he just started screaming. He got so scared that she had to take him away. He wouldn't give her the opportunity to get to their mailbox so she could check the mail. It was just so frightening to that little boy.
Because you guys with all these suits and masks on would have looked like something out of Doctor Who, I guess.
Really, not quite a Dalek, but close. And there were people. Well, there was the wife of one of the guys in the lab who worked in the munitions system, where she was loading a flare, and the flare went off accidentally, and she got burned really terribly. And the exercises were, in order for them to be real enough, they also had danger attached to them. Yeah. It was tough.
You're absolutely right about the dangers. I've always wondered on the numbers of people injured and killed in exercises or training through the Cold War, because they're sort of like the forgotten casualties. There's no memorial to those people.
You know, here in the U.S., they don't consider the Cold War a real war, but because there was no casualties as a result of fighting, but there were casualties. I heard of stories of people getting run over by tanks when they're wearing a gas mask and a helmet, and they can't really hear, and the tank can't really see them. Yeah. Or somebody trying to land an airplane on a highway in Germany, and they skid off, and we lost aircraft when I was there. They were training, and even before, when I was in high school, there was a F-101 or RF-101 that crashed near Lower Heyford, the other little village there. That the pilot stayed with the plane to be sure that it would not hit the school. Yeah. Well, what was it? There was a line from the movie Red October, and Sean Connery says that the Cold War was war, no battles, but lots of casualties.
Absolutely. Where do you progress then from Upper Heyford? Because you're there until, I've got the date here, 1983. What's next for you?
Well, I had decided that I needed to get out of PML. I had already worked on every piece of equipment they had.
Can you just tell me what PML stands for?
The Precision Measurement Equipment Laboratory.
Great. Okay.
And I was actually a precision measurement equipment technician. A specialist would have been one lower, a technician was higher, which meant that I should be able to do every task with no help. Whereas a specialist could do every task, but could use help in the most complex parts of it. I didn't want to get in the management of a laboratory. I just didn't want to play those games, and I wanted to be an engineer. And the Air Force had a program called called Airman Education Commissioning Program, where if you got accepted, they would send you back to college for 3 years maximum. They get an engineering degree, and then they'd send you to officer training school, and then off to a job as an engineer. And that's what I did. I took night classes because I had to have a minimum of 2 calculus classes and either one calculus-based physics, or calculus-based chemistry. And I did that at Upper Heyford, going to night school. And then I applied. There's a lot of paperwork involved, and you had to get endorsements. And the gentleman, the deputy commander for maintenance, his name was Colonel Thomas Ringley. I want to thank him so much. I mean, he had picked me out as NCO of the month early in '82, and then he named me maintenance NCO of the year, and he put that on my package, on his endorsement, saying that this is the kind of people we want to be officers. And I truly believe that that's the only reason I got accepted, because there were other people in avionics that applied that did not get accepted, even though they had better grades than I did. But the Air Force was looking for the all-around person. You would have thought I would want to be an electrical engineer. I didn't. I was in, where the Upper Heyford had that hardened avionics building. And I was in there one day working on the ECM test console. And there was an engineer there from Westinghouse Westinghouse made the ECM, the electronic countermeasure pod. And in all honesty, he asked me why, when he sticks his probe in an electrical outlet for an oscilloscope, the oscilloscope shows like 212 volts instead of 110. And I looked at him like this, and I said, "You're kidding me, right?" and he said, "No." And I said, "Because an oscilloscope is a peak-to-peak responding device. It's not a average responding or a root mean square." Anyway, what it showed me was that you can be an engineer and have no common sense. So my first choice was astronautical engineer. Second choice was aeronautical engineer, and third choice was electrical. There was a nuclear engineer option too, but I didn't want to do that. I'd had enough radiation stuff. And then I got accepted for astronautical engineer. That was before Christmas of '82. And the Air Force said, now you have to get accepted at a college. And all that really matters is that the college has either Air Force ROTC or some other in-place way of billing the government, billing the Air Force for my school. And of course, they had to have the program you wanted. And I called them up and I said, I don't really care where I go. I want to go someplace where I can stay in government housing. And they said, Ohio State University in Columbus. There was an old base outside of Columbus that wasn't completely closed, and the Air Force maintained the housing there. So we stayed in the housing for 3 years. I went to school and got my degree, went to officer training school. And after 90 fun-filled days in San Antonio, and then went to Colorado Springs, where I was a satellite engineer for the global positioning system. Did that for 3 years. Got a assignment change for humanitarian reasons to the Boston area, where I got assigned to the Air Force Geophysics Laboratory. This laboratory consisted of 4 science divisions: earth science, atmospheric science, near space, and deep space, and then the aerospace engineering, which is where I worked. So the scientists from these other divisions, they would come to us and say, hey, I got this experiment. I got to get it up to this altitude for this length of time. And this is how much money I have. So we would look at what he's got, how much money he has. We would decide if it's going to, if we could do it on a balloon, or if it has to go on a rocket, or put it on a shuttle, or even a satellite. And then we would make that happen and fly the experiment and hand the data back to the scientist. It was a fun job.
Nearest you ever got to getting into space, huh?
Yeah. There was one incident with, it was a joint Air Force, NASA, and European Space Agency, where we were launching rockets into thunderstorms that triggered lightning. And I didn't actually go out on the launch. My role was to predict the trajectory of these little tiny rockets. These were 2 3/4 inch folding fin aircraft rockets. They were left over from Vietnam. So we had kind of an unlimited number, free of charge. And we were launching at the Kennedy Space Center, and our target was to have the thing land in a lagoon. And I did about 1,400 launch simulations under different conditions, different wind directions and wind strengths and stuff like that, to come up with safety criteria where they could launch it and make sure the rocket went into the lagoon. Well, there was a French gentleman that was out there doing some work on the pad, and there was a rocket in the pad, and he accidentally ignited the rocket. And it went, I was so excited, it went right in the middle of the lagoon where I said it was going to go. Unfortunately, because it wasn't supposed to go, they hadn't cleared the lagoon. There's the guy there fishing, and he got pretty close. And he was really mad. So NASA said, that's it. You guys are out of here. So they packed everything up and went to a mountaintop in New Mexico where nobody cared about anything. And the whole point of that was to see, there's a effect called triggered lightning, where if you have a rocket or even an aircraft under certain conditions going through charged air, it will trigger a lightning bolt. In the case of the Space Shuttle, they had a really unusually low level that they had to meet. I had an experiment go up on the Space Shuttle in January of 92, and we got delayed for 2 hours because the electrostatic meter readings were above a certain point. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. It was perfectly blue. But eventually the meters got below that point. The shuttle got launched. It was the shuttle Discovery. And yeah, I got to see the launch. The Air Force sent me down there, not for the launch, even though I was invited by NASA for it. They sent me down for the press conference the day before in case somebody had questions about my payload. Nobody did. It was to measure reflected light from intergalactic and zodiacal dust, which means light bouncing off dust within the solar system and outside the solar system, in the star system.
Yeah, I can imagine the press not getting very excited about that.
Yeah, but the U.S. Naval Graduate School was running a refrigerator made out of a Pioneer woofer. They got excited about that.
Yeah.
But actually, the work that I did, that experiment laid down the basis of all the anti-missile systems that we have. Because there's three phases of a missile. During two of the phases, it's easy to track. The first one is when it's launched. There's fire coming out the tail end. It's easy to track, but it's a long ways away. The second one is when it's re-entering, coming back into the atmosphere. It's heating up. It's easy to track, but you got like one chance. The ideal time to hit it is when it's coasting through space. But essentially, what you have is a cold black body against the background of space. So in order to be able to track it, you have to know what the background of space looks like so you can see if something is blocking it. And that's what my experiment did, is it updated our database for the background of space. And that allowed the companies that were testing these rockets to make their sensors more sensitive and give them a higher probability of hitting the target. That was part of a bigger program called LEAP, which stood for Lightweight Exo-Atmospheric Projectile. And these were called kinetic kill vehicles. There was no warhead on these missiles. I mean, the rocket is traveling at 6 kilometers a second. And if you just hit it, it's gonna, you hit it with anything, it's gonna get splintered.
That wasn't part of the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative program.
They were paying for it. That was the beginnings of it. Yeah, my last assignment at the Geophysics lab, I did some neat stuff. It was a fun, great assignment.
Yeah, well, working with the Space Shuttle, that's pretty cool. So when did you retire from the US Air Force? What rank were you?
I was a captain. That was it. And I wasn't going to get any higher. I was allowed to stay in long enough to retire as an officer. Normally, you need 10 years commission time to retire as an officer, but they had so many officers that they cut that back to 8. So I did 8 years as a total of just under 22 years, and I was able to retire as a captain. But, you know, it's a small world. I run into people that I worked with at Heyford. Talking about the schools at Heyford, my son started school at Upper Heyford in the very same buildings that I went to high school at. He started school. When we lived in Colorado Springs, he met a guy in school. They weren't really close, but we moved to Boston, and he was in the same Boy Scout troop. And then his dad retired and I retired, and I don't know why they came to Ohio. We didn't plan on it, but we ended up here. And they ended up in the same high school, and they graduated high school together.
That's an unbelievable coincidence.
It's very serendipitous.
Yeah. I think in your notes, you tell me that and this is like 30 years after you've seen this plane, you're working at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Can you tell me about that.
Yeah, this was 30 years after I saw President Kennedy walk up to the top of the steps and into the plane. And many, many years later, there's a new president that gets a new fleet of Boeing 747s, and what was left was this plane that Kennedy had, and it ended up at their Museum of the United States Air Force, which is here at Wright-Patterson. It's the largest aviation museum in the world. And I went down during lunch one day after they'd put it on display, and I reached out and I touched the airplane. And I know I wasn't supposed to do that, but I touched the airplane anyway. And I was just overwhelmed by this feeling that the plane wanted to tell me everything that it had done since I saw it that fateful day in 1963. And I still, every time I go to the museum, I go visit that plane. When they restored the plane, they felt that it was, well, you know that when they brought Kennedy's body back, the crew refused to have it in the cargo hold. So in order to get it on the plane where the seats are, they had to cut a bulkhead out so they could get the coffin in there. And the bulkhead is there. Now you can see where it was cut. It's an amazing experience.
The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening and look forward to seeing you next week.